June 10th, 1999, Marian, Levy, and possibly Ken Irwin soon, who knows?
I think we mentioned earlier that one of the movies that was a favorite of George and the band was Charlie Barrick, The Last of the Independents, starring Walter Matthau. And so when we were starting this new label that was going to have the Nighthawks on it for one, and I think Roomful of Blues in the very beginning also came out on Barrick, we decided that it would be very neat to have a label that would be The Last of the Independents. And little did we realize that back in those days when we were talking about The Last of the Independents, how far away from its being The Last of the Independents, and in fact how newly and recently revitalized the whole independent part of the record business has become, but in a completely different way from how it existed at that time. So anyhow, Barrick became our way of releasing records other than just on Rounder. And in the evolution of distributors and the record business, what we realized eventually is if you release the same number of records on one label, they'll only focus on a certain number of them. Whereas if you release that same number, but only 2 apiece on maybe 4 different labels, you're likelier to get more attention, at least initially, in terms of giving each of those records their best shot, if they are the only 2 releases on 4 labels, as opposed to 8 releases on 1 label. And then, of course, certain other factors kind of fed into that, like our friend Bill Schubart at Philo becoming more and more, having that label become more and more inactive, and our taking it over, and then eventually buying it. So then that became our singer-songwriter kind of label. That was, I believe you're correct in what you said about that being after Heartbeat. Heartbeat was founded to be our reggae label.
First?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although I think Varick was the very first.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Which was our own wholly owned. Heartbeat was our own wholly owned. Philo, initially we were doing it more sort of as representing the label and taking a percentage, and then eventually, as it became clear that the ownership of Philo no longer wanted to be in the record business, we reached an agreement with them whereby it also became one of our wholly owned labels. And then went on from there, and I think it was in 1990, two, that we started Bullseye Blues and Jazz.
81 is the first Heartbeat.
Yes, that's what I thought. The first Barrick was when? It was the Nighthawks, wasn't it?
Yeah, we found it.
Yeah.
Which you called singer-songwriter, Varick. That was
Philo.
No. Right, Philo. No, but what was Varick's identity?
Varick's identity was more some of the other blues groups, like the Nighthawks and then Roomful of Blues.
Actually, it was 83. January of 83 was the first Varick. Heartbeat preceded.
Yeah, okay, you were right.
But that's not where you would have put older reissues of country blues or what have you.
No.
You had a series
right.
that you would funnel those into. Okay, and those would be Rounder releases.
The 2000 series were the pure blues things in the beginning, but then by the mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s, Scott was starting to do more recording in New Orleans, and we started our Modern New Orleans Masters series. And at that point it became obvious that the 2000 series was, particularly at a time when Scott and Ron, my husband at that time, were both producing a lot of blues records, that we had way more than we wanted just in the 2000 series. So, and blues was doing really well in terms of sales, and the market was a lot less saturated then than it is right now. And they were both doing a lot of producing, so we started Bullseye Blues initially, which is now Bullseye Blues and Jazz.
Are you studiously studying anything?
Yeah, just saying if there's anything else, I'm listening.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, I was curious, and this actually has developed some good stuff, and following through on Bill's suggestion, why don't you take a look at your early 80s releases, say the first half of the decade, and tell me what, is a particular favorite of yours, or 3 or 4 particular favorites of yours from those periods.
Well,
and why.
81 had the first Hazel Dickens solo record, hard-hitting songs for hard-hit women. Hard-hitting people. Sorry about that.
Ew, Ken, that's a Freudian slip.
And well, why? What's the meaning for you, aside from a personal one? What's the...
0135 is the first Johnson Mountain
Notice how
record.
he's going right over that.
Yeah, okay. We'll ask about another one as to what the meaning is for you beyond a personal. I want a personal one, just not a certain kind of personal one.
No, 0140 we asked about before. 1981 still is the first bluegrass album band that you were
Joe Connor.
asking
Well, I
about.
was curious about that. Why don't we focus on that a little bit, since it's something that's gotten a lot of attention. What was the impetus for that project? Why do it? You could have recorded any number of those people. I get it.
Well, it was a Tony Rice record.
It came together kind of accidentally in terms of what it was, right?
It was a Tony Rice record, and everybody contributed equally. And Tony felt that because of that, he wanted to share, and have it be more of a band situation.
Mm-hmm.
And there wasn't really a name for it. It became the Bluegrass Album Band, but it was really just called the Bluegrass Album at first. And that, in that respect, it was, wasn't really expected to be touring under that name. And then there was so much reaction, and there was a person who was interested in putting together tours. So there were a couple tours, and then a number of other dates when they just got together, when 3 or 4 of the people were going to be booked at a particular festival, and they booked the other people as a side group. So the 0135 was the beginning of the 10-year relationship with the Johnson Mountain Boys. And that came about through Walt Saunders, who mentioned to you previously. I don't remember if it was on tape or not.
Yeah.
And Walt was a fireman in suburban Virginia, Falls Church. And we had first become acquainted with him through his review of the Joe Lavelle record, where he gave it a very high rating and wrote wonderfully about it, and we wrote back
This was
to
the
him.
first, number 3? The first
Yeah.
one about it? Okay.
And then we started correspondence, and he mentioned that one of the tunes, Sparkling Brown Eyes, was originally done by Jerry and Sky, and were we familiar with them because they were from New England, and this just started this whole correspondence. And then for quite a while, when we were down in the area, we stayed over at his house and got to know him pretty well, and his family. And years later, he ran into the Johnson Mountain Boys, and became very close as his daughter was going out with a banjo player. And I mean, he was passionate about the music, but it added something else, and he really became like their #1 fan and supporter. And he invited Hazel Dickens and I over to dinner one night, and played us some rough tapes that had been made of the group. And then, as we were about to leave, his wife, we were just giving our customary hug as we left, and she wouldn't let go, and she said, "You are coming to see them on Sunday, aren't you?" And wouldn't let go until I said yes.
Who was that then?
Ruby Saunders.
Oh.
And so we did go, and ended up driving through, following directions, and going to the middle of nowhere in Maryland, to someplace, right across the street, practically from an old railroad track, and this little place called Susie's, which was, middle of the afternoon, and half the people were dancing to the music, and about 2/3 of the women, that might be a slight exaggeration, but half the women still had rollers in their hair, and it was pretty hardcore. Yeah, it was pretty hardcore. But as soon as I heard them, it was just it was like a revelation. They came on. They would, at that point, they were wearing suits and hats, and went running onto the stage, and there wasn't a stage there, but the equivalent of the stage where they were performing, and would just start off with a real fast fiddle tune, and then not even wait for the applause and go into the first tune. And Dudley Connell, who was the lead singer and tenor singer in the group, just had he just had one speed. He was just all out, singing as hard as he could, and with tremendous motion. Everybody else, they just moved great and put on a show, and it was just something that I'd never seen. Maybe it was like that in the early days, but something that I certainly hadn't seen before that. When most bluegrassers got up there and stayed at their microphones, and there wasn't much for show. You either liked the music or you didn't. And
Plus that suburban, remember I was talking about my impressions of bluegrass festivals in the 70s, and the J&B were a welcome change from that, because at least a romanticized version of how bluegrass would have been in the early days was that there was a lot of fire and physical energy, because the 70s bluegrass groups were really the antithesis of that. And there were these high nasal voices that were almost like a parody of the early days of bluegrass, and everyone was ramrod stiff. God forbid if they, you felt that if they did one thing different, that they would fall over or something, that their backs would break, because they were so stiff and uptight and rigid and puritanical. And the JMB just had a lot more youthful vigor and sparkle
and soul, which was something that was sort of lacking.
Well, it was a different kind. It was a different kind of soul, and it was particularly refreshing, as I say, following on the heels of that sort of the suburban bluegrass thing of the 70s.
Well, how did certain things are obvious in terms of the clothes but when Tony Rice and his contemporaries were doing the bluegrass band albums, what differences did you see between the product that you were producing, and the J&B?
They were a lot slicker. And I mean, even though there was a lot of improvisation in their playing and stuff, they were all, well,
because those guys weren't caricatures either. I wouldn't call them caricatures.
well, they actually, but they were still, in terms of the look, they were much more in keeping with those, of wearing those little niche, funny colored shirts and stuff that the suburban bluegrass guys did.
Yeah.
Whether it was Tony Rice and, David Grisman looked a little more like a hippie.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that J&B, unlike, say, Country Cooking in terms of their look was very much at odds with the prevailing 70s suburban bluegrass thing.
Mm-hmm.
But they were hippies.
Yes.
The J&B guys were, in fact, much more like the suburban people who kept suburban bluegrass going. But they were playing traditional music, which Country Cooking and Breakfast Special and those guys certainly never intended to do or made any pretenses of doing. Right, Ken, would you say that's approximately?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Good answer.
He usually says that.
Well, what is this? Number 141, Blackguardy. I don't know what that word means. Blackguardy folk songs from the southern United States.
It means dirty songs to white people who don't dare to say, something that is more outright pornographic. But most of them are these sort of Puritan guys doing these strange songs about sex that have words like blackguardy in them that they think are terribly racy.
It's interesting, it's right next to the Bluegrass album band.
It's a Mark Wilson.
Mark Wilson did this.
Yeah.
Glenn Orland is on this, and Jim Garland, and Smokey Rogers.
And then there's some people who have fictitious names there, who didn't want their,
Didn't want to be associated with dirty songs.
yeah.
Who else is on this record under a fictitious name?
Mark Workman. I think with at least one of the artists, Mark had to go record it outside behind, it was like behind a barn.
Behind the outhouse or
Yeah,
something.
where the family wouldn't hear him.
What else strikes you in the early 80s? Or Marian, do you want to take a gander at that and tell me what...
Oh, I hate being too historically literal, you know.
Well, yeah,
Early
this is,
80s.
you know, I can't get these Johnson Mountain Boy stories unless I can...
Well, and
Well, I don't
again,
wanna
it
be
was a
remembered
very
as
I can
good,
do that's the.
it was a very good example of how all three of us thought very similarly, though, because
Yeah.
even though Ken was involved with Hazel Dickens
Yeah.
at that time, and even though Ken and Hazel were the first ones to hear the Johnson Mountain Boys, when they first played up here, because the bass player of that time had a relative on the Cape, and we went to hear them at, I don't know, some VFW or something like that kind of hall. All three of us were in the audience, and all three of us thought that they were just
Yeah, by the second
absolutely
song, we
awesome.
were, everybody was, yeah.
in
I
total
mean,
agreement.
it's about the quickest that I've ever seen us all agree on
Yeah.
any act.
Thought they were absolutely awesome. That was,
And they
that was the
remain,
style of
yeah.
bluegrass that we could die for.
Yeah. And that was, for me, the closest working relationship with a band that I'd ever had, and doubt that I will ever have that kind of relationship again.
Really?
Nancy Given, Newbury.
It's, I mean, partially the group itself and the people and the way that they thought, and partially the period in my life and their
Now, what
lives.
Ken also
Yeah.
doesn't, in terms of leaving out historical overview, we already at that point, the same as when we started working with Allison Krauss, had such a substantial and impressive catalog of traditional bluegrass that these guys were, to be on Rounder was like being recorded by God. So Ken actually smoothing over a little bit of the fact that there wasn't always total agreement. It was sometimes problematic, his working with the Johnson Mountain Boys, and Dudley would sometimes call up and kvetch, and so would some of the other guys in the band. They always worked it out, but since they really respected Ken as a producer, and Rounder was the label that they wanted to be on, I mean, otherwise, Lord knows, they wouldn't travel all the way from D.C. to play in this place way out in the boonies just to have the three owners of the company go hear them. So they always worked it out, and the result were probably the best bluegrass records in our catalog for traditional bluegrass.
What else strikes you in the early 80s? What's your...
You know, I
Most
can't really remember
enjoyable.
too much about the early 80s.
Well, that's okay. I've never heard that said about the 80s
Want to give
before.
give me the numbers?
I heard it said about the 60s.
We were still doing a lot of work with George Thorogood and the Destroyers.
Yeah.
And what, of course, the production schedule does not reflect is that George Thorogood and the Destroyers opened the Rolling Stones
Right.
North American tour dates in 1981.
Mhm.
No, or was it
Steve
1980?
Young, John Hammond, Bela Fleck, Ricky Skaggs, Dry Branch, Blue Sky Boys, Johnson Mountain Boys again. Yeah, I should say that we did the second Johnson Mountain Boys record very, very quickly. We told Dudley right at the time that we thought he would burn his voice out singing like that. He sang so hard and with such a band, and usually we'd wait longer, but we just sort of jumped in.
But
Gatemouth
to give a
Brown.
little more overview of the whole thing, I think 81 is when, I guess it would have been probably more like around 1980. Was it 80 that the Rolling Stones tour was, that Thorogood
I
opened all
think
the
it's
dates?
81, but I'm not sure.
I thought I remembered that 81 is when we actually signed the deal, which was the first kind of contract like this that we'd ever signed. We actually formed a joint venture with George Thorogood and the Destroyers. And so it's actually George's name and my name that's on the contract with EMI, which later became EMI America, which later became whatever it is, whatever it was. But we actually encouraged George to leave independent distribution when we saw what a lame job they did with selling his records during the Stone store.
Well, especially one distributor down in New Orleans who ordered 25 copies of each record for a Superdome appearance.
Opening for the Stones
Yeah.
at the Superdome, and he said, well, I'll take a box of 25 each. But the other part of that too was that George was opening and was interested in playing larger and larger dates like that. So we kind of convinced him if that's what he wanted to do, independent distribution was not going to be the best avenue for doing it. And at that time, we never had an acrimonious or a bad relationship or a parting of the ways, but at that point it was also still a very, very close relationship. So he listened to us, and we hired a very good attorney, high-powered entertainment attorney for the first time in our history in LA. And we were being so sought by so many major labels at that point that we actually had Jerry Margolis, who was, as I say, a fairly high-powered entertainment attorney, but someone who was also known as someone who had some understanding of artistic matters and somebody being independent in the way that we are. And he went to each of the labels who had approached us and said, this is the deal that the Rounders and the Destroyers are looking for. So it didn't turn into a bidding war, but something where we literally would give them a far smaller number of records to be delivered than major label contracts, even at that time, called for, and where we would have as much involvement and control over the promotion as we wanted, and where the records would be delivered literally by the group and us, with no input from them unless we requested it. And they all agreed to that and to the financial bottom line. And then what we did is went around and visited each of those labels, which included meeting with Doug Morris and Ahmet Erdogan at Atlantic, with David Geffen, who had only, at that time, only recently started Geffen Records with Ed Rosenblatt as his sort of chief lieutenant. Met with Gary Gersh, and I forget who was the president of Capitol at that point, and then also met with EMI, and liked their approach, and liked the people, and felt that they seemed that they could...
Jim Moss.
Yeah, but I mean the president of Capitol,
Yeah.
who we also met with. I wouldn't forget Jim. But Gary Gersh, I mentioned Gary Gersh as being at Capitol, who later became the president of Capitol, but at that time he was with EMI and as the A&R person. So that was a very different kind of experience than we'd ever had before, and it made us, I would say, certainly made us more aware of some of the upper echelons of the record business and places that a highly successful, in terms of numbers, that a highly successful group could get to if they were, maximally successful sales-wise and so on. And at the same time, continue to do, obviously, the same kinds of records and repeat records by the groups that we've been working with all along.
One of my other favorite records of the 80s was the first Whitstone Brothers record, which was 1985. And went to a show here that the Boston Bluegrass Union put on with Jim and Jesse. And Jesse said in the beginning, before the show, that he had a tape he'd like to play for me. And afterwards I looked for him all over the place and I couldn't find him. This was in a different venue than most of the BB shows. And I was just about leaving and to leave, and I was in my car, and Jesse came out and said, here's the tape, and put it in my car and could not believe it. these were demo tapes or a session that they had done in a small studio in Shreveport, and they just sounded incredibly like the Louvens, and there were some Leuven songs on it. And I just, I pulled over to the side. I mean, you hear about those things, but it's just astonishing to me that a group like this could be around and nobody know about it. Not that it was heavily commercial, but it was just, so it's such wonderful music. And afterwards, I called up. I don't know if I think their phone number was on the thing, and I called up, and I got Charles Wittstein's wife, Ida, on the phone, and she didn't know anything about Rounder. And at that point, we had put out a Leuven Brothers record, and we had put out
Reissue
Lilly
all the
Brothers, the
yeah.
Blue Sky Boys, Hazel and Alice, and we'd done Bailey Brothers, almost every the Morris Brothers. We'd done all this duet stuff. But she hadn't heard about Rounder, so I had to convince her that we were into duet music and give a real sales pitch. Here they were down in Pineville, Louisiana, and hadn't really done anything in years.
Which is sort of suburban Shreveport.
Yeah. So, Alexandria.
Yeah.
And shortly thereafter, drove down there to meet them and to court them. And then we realized it wasn't going to be a huge seller. It was just something that I really felt passionate about. It was sort of at that time that almost anybody who would listen, I'd play their demo over the phone, just listen to what I heard, and some people here thought that I was a little bit nuts.
I don't think so.
No.
Not about the Wittsteins.
Yeah. So
You think you're about nuts, but
Yeah.
not about the Wittsteins.
So we ended up
We all
setting
like
up
Jim
a
and
recording
Jesse and
session.
the Leuven brothers too.
Yeah, we set up a recording session, and a small grouping. It was Tommy Goldsmith on guitar, and Blaine Sprouse on fiddle, and Jerry Douglas on dobro, and Roy Husky on bass, no banjo. And Charles played a little bit of mandolin. And the first day we laid down tracks, and it was just great, except that Charles was so nervous that he lost his voice. And that his wife ended up singing the harmony part so that people would know what was going on, so they wouldn't be stepping on it. And for instance, second day he did, he got better. And I think the third day his wife had to leave, and that was the first night since they'd been married, something like 25 years that they'd been apart. Felt terribly about that. That we got the record done, and there's one story on that's still one of my favorites.
Are you talking about Ida and her husband?
Yeah, they had never been separated for a night.
Because she's such a control freak, she'd never let him out of her sight, that's why, if you ask me. This woman is one of those who would inspire the kind of Freudian slip that Ken made
Right.
earlier.
We were mixing the record. Jim Rooney was the engineer doing it at Jack Clement's studio. And I think Nancy Griffith came in for
I was
for
just
those
gonna,
sessions.
Is that right?
in fact, I was gonna just say that if she didn't, it was around that same time.
Yeah, she wanted to be signed, and she came in these short shorts, I remember, and was sort of waltzing around the studio.
What year was this? I know you're talking about
85.
85, huh?
Yeah. And
The first record we did with her was what? Once in a Very Blue Moon.
That was
Yeah.
on Philo, right? When you were
Yeah.
on Philo?
Which was on Philo, and then after we put that out, and it did well, and she was at a really important point in her career in terms of just doing lots and lots of national touring for the first time. So she was like one of the hottest people on the folk circuit at that point. And then she brought all of the 3 records, I think, that she had released
two
previously
others.
on her own, 2 others, and we subsequently put those out on Philo. And then the last of the True Believers was was one that we did together on Philo. That was the last one before she
Yeah.
signed to whatever it was it NCA?
MCA she went to.
Yeah.
Yeah, which never sold her records as well as we did. I mean, she did better with some major labels later, but not in MCA.
But we were in the studio mixing, and Charles and Robert were there, and I was working with Jim. Jim was aboard, and I was right behind him with Robert and Charles. And I looked over, and Charles and Robert were looking at each other. They often would communicate without really saying anything. And I looked over and said, "Charles, what's wrong?" And he sort of thought about it for a bit, and he said, "Well, Robert's in mono, and I'm in treble." And I looked at Rudy, and Rudy looked at me, and Rudy looked up in the air, and then started fiddling. Just started playing with the dials, and we finally got something together. There was a time on I think it was the next record, when we were just getting started on the record, and we were in a...
Marian Levy, Carrie Estrin is on 00. Marian Levy,
Okay,
Carrie
I'll follow
Estrin
that.
on 00.
Yeah, Carrie's coming up sometime toward the end of the month.
really?
Actually.
And we were in the motel, and Charles and Robert were sitting on the floor playing tunes. We were trying to decide which ones to use on the arrangements. I think Hazel was there, and Jerry Douglas, and Ida. And Robert was playing the guitar. Charles was sitting right next to him with his arm around Robert. And they were doing these tunes, and they got to this one tune, and they were playing along, and then they just stopped. And they started again with a totally different arrangement. Nobody said anything. None of us saw anything with eyebrows raising or any kind of thing. Just did this totally different arrangement. And Jerry Douglas looked over and he said, "One mind." Karen, do you have any, want to talk about Bob Crumb?
No, not particularly.
Christine?
No, she was another who was really kind of at the top of the folk circuit
Christine
thing
Olsen,
around
is
the
that what
same
she-
time. Christine
yeah.
Lavin at the
Oh,
same
Christine
time
Lavin,
that.
okay.
Well, she wasn't when she, later on,
Well,
but when we
the
signed
same-
her, she was.
About the same time that Nancy Griffith
Yeah.
was. She was really kind of taking off at that point though too. And both of them were sort of right before Suzanne Vegas reached success. And building up to that.
In a lot of the interviews with you, a lot of them, there's not, I haven't found terribly many of them, but there's always this, you talk about this trio of things that makes it important. It makes you want to work with somebody. You got to like the music, you got to like the people, and the third one is the one that changed from we got to be able to at least break even to we've got to be able to make money.
Right.
And when did that realization come to you, and how hard was it? Did
I think
you talk
someone
about it
else
with
told
somebody?
us. I don't think we came to. I think somebody else forced it on it, whether it was one of our accountants or.
No, I don't think so.
Mm.
I think that would sort of make it sound more like something that fits something that you think is the way business should run, but isn't really.
Mhm.
I think that in fact, just the way the record business itself operated up until around the era that CDs started coming out, it was much simpler to break even. But we also, and it was simpler to release a record prior to CDs also because you didn't have as many configurations, even when there were cassettes and LPs. Cassettes were obviously a lot cheaper than CDs. And the other part of it is that we also, it came to the point of, I think that realization came about partly when we were made aware that in fact when we talked about breaking even, we weren't in fact breaking even. We were often losing money because we weren't factoring in things like overhead expenses. And over the years, as the company grew, that the cost of the infrastructure and the overhead has increased. Obviously not to the level that it is when you talk about, the kinds of facilities and staff that major labels have. But for a label doing our type of music, it's fairly considerable. And that's when we realized that you can't go on indefinitely losing money, even though we had to pat ourselves on the back and make ourselves feel good, had been calling it breaking even, when we hadn't been in many cases.
A little bit of time frame on that. Are we talking about mid to late 80s, 86, 87, 88?
Well, I would say that probably, as I say, during the CD era.
Which is about 87, 88, 89, I think. I would remember that as being 87. when
Probably
CDs
the
started.
last half of the 80s is when we were putting out substantial numbers of CDs, and I would say it was by the mid-1990s that it was perfectly clear that, in fact, we hadn't been correctly figuring our own costs. That in a certain sense, we were acting like certain costs didn't exist, and acting like the release of a record kind of existed in a vacuum. What forced that realization upon us is when everybody started getting hit with the kinds of returns that we got from Best Buy by, say, 96. Everybody was selling lots of CDs in 95, and by 1996, lots of CDs were being returned. And then you start thinking, oh, it's the returns that are the reason. And then you look at it a little bit more carefully and you find out that not only were the returns killing us, but the fact that we weren't even allocating and figuring how much it was costing us to release and to promote and to simply maintain the catalog, how much all of that was costing us.
You referred first day
And computerization, I would say, also allowed us to be more accurate than we ever had been before.
Well, let me jump ahead, actually. I want to move into something we talked about last night when you said you didn't want to speak for Marian. He said, and this is something I'm really, really very interested in, I plucked out because it was lying on the floor and because it was new, this Kentucky Old Time Banjo CD that recently came out. It's a Mark Wilson project. And I was talking to both Ken and Bill as to what the hell do you do with a CD of this nature nowadays? And, do you promote it? Do you just send it out into the stream? And I guess my question is, can Rounder continue continue to put those things out in the future? For how long? And if not, what does that mean to you as a company? How do you get something like that out?
It's if you don't mind my answering that, Ken, I'd like you to listen to this too. If you don't mind my answering that in this sort of a larger framework of what it means in the marketplace.
I would like you to, yeah.
And the fact that there's an evolving marketplace. I mean, one thing that we all would agree upon is that things are changing very much and very fast. And then, in fact, the internet may make it so that, in fact, you can reach the few people who would buy those much more easily in terms of letting people know that this exists than perhaps was the case in the past. So, in fact, it may make it, the technology now may make it in the future at some point, not right away, easy to reach the people who actually want this, where we won't have to promote it and do the kinds of things that in the past we would have felt compelled to at least do a minimal promotional press or radio run. But the other thing I wanted to say is I think that one of the things that we've all realized, and I in particular, is that with the number of releases, we no longer are as special a company as we were. We represent something different in the marketplace, and in our own minds we're doing exactly what we were doing. But what we represent in the marketplace is not the same. That's one of the reasons that we now compete more often, and sometimes unsuccessfully, with labels like Shawnee, and with some of the smaller boutique imprints that are distributed by major labels. So in a sense, we're in a transitional time, not just in terms of the market, but in terms of finding a new place for Rounder if it's going to continue to have the kind of specialness and prestige and be able to let people know what Rounder represents as a label in terms of identity. Because the market is so flooded, there are so, with 30,000 releases, as we're talking about, close to that coming out last year. There are lots and lots of companies doing absolutely fascinating and funny little releases that in the past Rounder would have been putting out as the only company, and that's no longer the case. So I think that there is a danger at this point in time that Rounder may become the boutique label of just its owner's tastes. And I don't think that in the past, even when in fact we all put out records that we like, there was not that danger because we represented something that at that point was much more underrepresented in the marketplace, and that is now no longer the case. The other thing is you can't get the records into the stores in most cases, and there's nothing they can do about that. They have shrinking space and a greater number of releases to buy. Therefore, to simply get it into any kind of realistic space where it's going to get sold, you have to spend more money. Therefore, you can't take a record simply because you like it and it's a neat record and spend what it would take to simply get it even in the stores, in a whole chain of stores.
Where does it go? Do you see yourself as able in the future to release an old-time fiddle music, either newly recorded or a reissue?
I think that we can, but I think that we have to be.
Recording?
I think that we can, but I think we have to be realistic about the fact that there is a diminishing number of people to buy those, even of the limited number of people in the past, because there are more choices that people have to make for where they spend that particular amount of money that it would take to buy a CD. And therefore, we need to be able to reach those people in literally the most direct and efficient way possible, because we can't afford to fool around, because everything is getting more and more fragmented at the same time that things are becoming more and more specialized and more centralized and consolidated in the business overall. So things are much more dog eat dog. And I think that in fact, we talked, I think you and I did the first day, about both the upside and the downside, the dark side and the bright side of the future, the optimistic things, the fact that, as I just said now, there are things that may allow us to be able to reach those people more directly and to educate people in better ways by simply having them click onto our website. But at the same time, I think part of the reason we're in a transitional time ourselves is I think that whether Rounder simply decides it's going to stay exactly the way it always has, and then sort of fades more and more in terms of its star's luster, the star of the label itself, will depend in part on choices that we make in terms of our own vision. And I think that vision right now, you're talking to us at a good time because it's a very transitional time in terms of that vision. And I think for the first time, Ken, Bill, and I are sort of looking and having lots and lots of dialogue to see how much agreement there is among us about what that vision, what needs to constitute that vision. And I would say there are more differences between us than ever before, which doesn't mean that anything disastrous is going to happen. We have enough infrastructure that Rounder will always continue, I think, just the way Folkways always did, because we all do care about it enough and have the goal that what's good for Rounder must always be paramount. But I think that we all have slightly different interpretations of what is necessary, what is needful at this time in the record business. And to me, one of the things that is needful to help Rounder attain a status that it once had, and in my opinion, has one of the reasons that we now lose out to some of the artists that we do, is not just the competition among other labels of our size and so on, but is also because there just needs to be a broader vision. And by broader, I don't necessarily mean more pop. I don't mean anything about selling out our integrity.
I mean that it just means that that we can't be exclusively focused on the things that we once were exclusively focused on.
Chris Strachwitz has said to me, he's
See,
very
Chris
pessimistic.
has
He said-
always, Chris has always been the exact, I should say, going back to George Thorogood, when Chris's advice to us, and he loved George and the guys, and immediately he said, you need to sell his contract to a major label, that's what I would do. And it's not that I believe that that would have been wrong for him, I think that would have been exactly the right thing for him to do. But that's a big part, the fact that we didn't do that at that time indicates one of the major differences between our vision at that time and the vision of some of the people who have always been our inspirations and will always continue to be our inspirations, but is not the same as our path.
What
We
he's-
did not do that, and there's a big lesson therein.
Well, what he said to me, and I said this to you last night, is that he has said that he's very pessimistic about the ability to continue to sell purely traditional music,
Mhm.
which leaves Chris Strachwitz, I think, nowhere.
Mhm.
Which leaves Arhuli going
Yes.
away as Chris goes away.
Yes.
That's
And where-
Yeah,
and-
I really don't see Tom Diamond going out in the field and,
yeah.
you know, and finding the type of stuff or,
But that's not
Yeah.
the problem. There are
Yeah.
plenty of Chris Strachwitz, people who would do that. The point is,
Yes,
and
but
I
you can't
think that
sell
it's
it.
very easy for us to simply
Yeah.
stick our heads in the sand and say, there's so much stuff, good stuff for us to put out, we'll always be able to continue.
Yeah.
But that is not the point. What the point is that the marketplace forces.
Well, that's Chris
so
is saying. Chris is
mitigate
saying you can't
against
sell
that.
it.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And I think that we can sell it, but whether we can afford to put it out, unless we have some more substantially money-making parts of the company, that will in fact do what we have always done, which we kidded ourselves about for decades, which is subsidize those records.
Right. How do you mean?
And the
you kidded-
government ain't gonna give us that
Now, how do
money.
you mean you kidded yourself about it?
Because
I
we
mean, it's-
basically would say, oh, well, we're breaking even from a
Okay.
strict dollars and cents standpoint, when in fact we weren't even figuring anything that a regular business knows that they have to figure in which whenever we got in trouble, we'd then have to cut back radically because we realized that, oh, well, we're not making money. Then we'd turn things around and then we'd do exactly what we did before. And I think that as people age, they like to feel that if they simply continue to do exactly what they've always done, everything will be fine. And of course, the world doesn't sit still and let you do that.
How successful is the company in doing meaningful genre promotion? You know, working within developing specific techniques to sell Cajun records, Zydeco records, blues records, bluegrass records. Do you talk about that a lot?
I think
or do you-
that, yeah, we do talk about it a lot, and I think we've done a number of very, very good programs like that. It's never going to be something that's going to make the company tons of money, but it's important for us to do it because it's catalog that in many cases is simply sitting there if we don't do that. And second of all, it's important to always be trying to do things to reach the consumer in terms of educating them. So I think in terms of its having a long-term benefit, it's almost as much that it's a promotional benefit as it is a dollars and cents benefit. So if you can break even on a promotion like that, then a lot of times that's about the best you can do.
What about, are you...
I have a doctor's appointment in the afternoon, and I have to do some work for a little
Okay.
while, so we can catch up.
Okay, can you
later
sit
on.
for a couple of...
Aaron, I've been sitting for a lot of time, and we did stuff
That's
last
fine,
night.
it's
so-
just that Michael